ceremony. Anyone else rather warm? Or is it just me?
I was quite warm earlier on.
See, it's come a bit warmer since I decided the break.
Not too warm.
Okay,
It's
well,
comfortable.
yeah,
It's comfortable.
it's okay as it is, but if it gets
Any
any
warmer,
warmer, we'll start
Yeah,
falling
we
asleep, won't we?
especially after dinner.
So just
Exactly. Yeah, that's the session way.
Maybe the storage and slightly better. Just parts.
we're all here, yeah. Okay. So the time has slipped a little bit, predictably. Just say something about time as well. So it is helpful, and we've had to sort of set things up and things, so you know it's just fine. But it is helpful if we can try and keep fairly strictly to time. It's been advertised as 10:30 to 4:30, so that's what we'll do today. Well, I was going to actually consult with you because I had in mind 10 o'clock till 5 actually, and if that works then that would be my preference going forward. But will anybody not be able to get here for 10 o'clock on Sunday is one key question. Is anybody?
I would struggle. My first train is about 1:45, so I might have to get about 10 past, 1:15, but not quite 10.
Well, then I think we'd better make it a 10:30 start on Sunday. Yeah.
What time are you doing? 10:30 till 5?
If everybody's happy with that, is 5 o'clock a problem for any 5 o'clock finish a problem for anybody? Is everyone happy to have a 5 o'clock finish today? In spite of the fact that you weren't
I'm going to have to
forewarned.
go about 1:45 because I've got a lift coming.
Okay. Well, we'll keep to the advertised time for today.
Okay, from tomorrow onwards.
From tomorrow onwards. And is everyone okay to make to get here for 10 on a Saturday?
I'd probably be. I'm happy for it to start at 10, but I'd probably just be a bit after.
I don't want
But
anybody to have to be late. Yeah.
what about making the lunch shorter?
No, I don't want to do that. Actually, the lunch break is shorter than I would like it to be. I think it's important. The breaks are important. I feel, people, you know, it's no good if you late in the day you kind of getting stressed and you can't take in what's being said. So, okay. So I think then we'll say it's going to be 10:30 till 5.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's happy with that? Great.
Sorry, is that Saturday or Sunday?
Both days.
Both days.
Both days.
10:30 to 5.
Yeah.
As of tomorrow.
As of tomorrow, if everyone's okay for tomorrow. Yeah. Right. Okay. So, are we recording?
I think so.
You press the button, that's all I want to know. Okay, that's fine. I need to put the mic on, all right.
And is that, check that's turned on.
Yeah, that's all right. That's it. So, after today, we have our sound engineer who's going to make sure everything's tickety-boo on the audio and video technology. Also need another engineer to get the clip mic on. Right.
Maybe you can just keep one microphone, and I'm not sure if you have to.
The reason for this microphone is so that we can hear the question and answer.
Okay. Yeah.
So, you know, we'll check that that's working. If it doesn't work this time, we can deal with it. But all right.
So it is live stream.
Yes, David, are you going to, we're going to turn off the live stream for questions?
I guess we can do that. Yeah, it means we won't get a video recording of the questions, but yeah, we can do that. So we will have audio recording, but that won't be going public. That'll only be for this group. Okay. We might do that with the video as well. Actually, we can perhaps work out a way to do that so that none of it is going public. We'll see. I mean, I don't have a problem with the talks being public, but I understand people may have issues with, you know, making the discussion Q&A public. Okay. So I think we've finished with the preliminaries. And what we'll do to start with is we'll just, I think we'll do a few mantras and then we're going to read the sutra together. Okay. So if you just take a moment.
Did you turn off the heating? Or?
It's because they wanted it.
Is anybody cold?
No.
So I think it's warm.
Yeah.
It's a new one, isn't it? Not as easy as the old one. Okay, so just take a moment to settle the mind and body. Take a few breaths. And we're going to recite the mantra of Shakyamuni Buddha. If you don't know it, I'm sure you'll pick it up soon enough. Those of you who know it can join in. Tayata Om Mune Mune Mahamunaye Soha 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 Tayata Om Mune Mune Mahamunaye
soha. Tayata om mune mune mahamunaye soha. Tayata om mune mune mahamunaye soha. Tayata om mune mune mahamunaye soha. Tayata om mune mune mahamunaye soha. Tayata om mune mune mahamunaye soha. Tayata om mune mune mahamunaye soha. Tayata om mune mune mahamunaye soha. Tayata om mune mune mahamunaye soha. Tayata om mune mune mahamunaye soha. Tayata om mune mune mahamunaye soha. Tayata om mune mune mahamunaye soha. Tayata om mune mune mahamunaye soha. Tayata om mune mune mahamunaye soha. Tayata om mune mune mahamunaye soha. So we recite the sutra together. You should all have a copy. Thus have I heard. At one time the Blessed One was living in the deer park at Isipatana, the resort of seers near Benares. There he addressed the group of 5 monks. Monks, these 2 extremes ought not to be practiced by one who has gone forth from the household life. What are the 2? There is devotion to the indulgence of sense pleasures, which is low, common, the way of ordinary people, unworthy and unprofitable. And there is devotion to self-mortification, which is painful, unworthy and unprofitable. Avoiding both these extremes, the Tathagata has realized the middle path. It gives vision, it gives knowledge, and it leads to calm, to insight, to enlightenment, to nibbana. And what is that middle path? It is simply the noble eightfold path, namely right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. This is the middle path realized by the Tathagata, which gives vision, which gives knowledge, and which leads to calm, to insight, to enlightenment, to nirvana. The noble truth of suffering is this: birth is suffering, aging is suffering, sickness is suffering, death is suffering. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are suffering. Association with the unpleasant is suffering. Dissociation from the pleasant is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the 5 aggregates of attachment are suffering. The noble truth of the origin of suffering is this: it is this thirst, craving, which produces re-existence and re-becoming, bound up with passionate greed. It finds fresh delight now here and now there, namely craving for sense pleasures, craving for existence and becoming, and craving for self-annihilation. The noble truth of the cessation of suffering is this: it is the complete cessation of that very craving, giving it up, renouncing it, emancipating oneself from it, detaching oneself from it. The noble truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering is this: it is simply the noble eightfold path, namely right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. This is the noble truth of suffering. Such was the vision, the knowledge, the wisdom, the science, the light that arose in me with regard to things not heard before. This suffering should be fully understood as a noble truth. Such was the vision, the knowledge, the wisdom, the science, the light that arose in me with regard to things not heard before. This suffering has been fully understood as a noble truth. Such was the vision, the knowledge, the wisdom, the science, the light that arose in me with regard to things not heard before. This is the noble truth of the origin of suffering. Such was the vision, the knowledge, the wisdom, the science, the light that arose in me with regard to things not heard before. This origin of suffering as a noble truth should be abandoned. Such was the vision, the knowledge, the wisdom, the science, the light that arose in me with regard to things not heard before. This origin of suffering as a noble truth has been abandoned. Such was the vision, the knowledge, the wisdom, the science, the light that arose in me with regard to things not heard before. This is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. Such was the vision, the knowledge, the wisdom, the science, the light that arose in me with regard to things not heard before. This cessation of suffering as a noble truth should be realized. Such was the vision, the knowledge, the wisdom, the science, the light that arose in me with regard to things not heard before. This cessation of suffering as a noble truth has been realized. Such was the vision, the knowledge, the wisdom, the science, the light that arose in me with regard to things not heard before. This is the noble truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering. Such was the vision, the knowledge, the wisdom, the science, the light that arose in me with regard to things not heard before. This path leading to the cessation of suffering as a noble truth should be cultivated. Such was the vision, the knowledge, the wisdom, the science, the light that arose in me with regard to things not heard before. This path leading to the cessation of suffering as a noble truth has been cultivated. Such was the vision, the knowledge, the wisdom, the science, the light that arose in me with regard to things not heard before. As long as my vision of true knowledge was not fully clear in these 3 aspects, in these 12 ways regarding the 4 noble truths, I did not claim to have realized the perfect enlightenment that is supreme in this world with its gods, with its Maras and Brahmas, in this world with its recluses and Brahmanas, with its princes and men. But when my vision of true knowledge was fully clear in these 3 aspects, in these 12 ways regarding the 4 noble truths, then I claimed to have realized the perfect enlightenment that is supreme in the world with its gods, with its Maras and Brahmas, in this world with its recluses and Brahmanas, with its princes and men. And a vision of true knowledge arose in me thus: my heart's deliverance is unassailable. This is the last birth. Now there is no more rebirth. This the Blessed One said. The group of 5 bhikshus was glad, and they rejoiced at his words. So this sutra has a special place in the Buddhist scriptures. It was, of course, the very first teaching that the Buddha gave. And in a sense, it is a complete teaching. You can kind of say that everything else, all of the other sutras and all of the other scriptures and writings of Buddhism are all commentaries on this. So the Buddha taught for 45 years after he became enlightened, but the essence of the Buddha's teaching is summed up in this one very short teaching. So if we understand this and put it into practice, in a way that's all we need to do. I mean, there is, of course, there are different ways to understand it and different ways to relate to the teaching that's given here. And there is a difference between the way to understand and practice this teaching. If one's level of motivation is the Hinayana, is seeking freedom from suffering for oneself, or if it is a Mahayana. And so there's a lot more to be said from the Mahayana, particularly from the Mahayana point of view, about how we should relate to this teaching. But the teaching itself is the basis, the foundation of all Buddhist teachings accepted. In my in my notes I say by all Buddhist traditions, or perhaps we should say by all authentic Buddhist traditions, but certainly by all the major Buddhist traditions and most of the minor ones. And I would say there are different definitions of what it means to be a Buddhist, but one valid definition is, if you accept these 4 noble truths as the sort of the main principle of the spiritual life, then you're a Buddhist. Anything to be an authentic Buddhist teaching, it has to be consistent with these, at least. In fact, you can really say it has to relate to one or other. I'm going to refer a little bit to my notes because certain things that I want to cover. So, Geshe Tashi particularly, and also His Holiness the Dalai Lama actually, that emphasize this sutra very much. Often it's not actually referred to explicitly in a lot of Tibetan Buddhist teachings. In Theravada tradition, it's certainly very, very fundamental. You'll hear a lot about it. In the Tibetan tradition, it's kind of been absorbed into the things like the Lamrim, which is a presentation of the whole Mahayana teachings. It's absolutely there in the sort of middle scope of the Lamrim. But this sutra itself isn't to the forefront, but the 4 noble truths themselves are, I think we should really bear them in mind throughout all our Buddhist practice and all our study. they're very simple on an intellectual. It's very easy to understand. Pretty much most of these very easy to understand on an intellectual level. But again, there's different levels of understanding, aren't there? And what we need is the level of understanding where it really begins to affect and transform our life. And so for that reason, we need not only to, read the sutra and maybe read some sort of commentary or writings about it, but also to think deeply about it and to meditate on each of these four noble truths and on different aspects of that. So we will talk about that. This version of the sutra actually comes from the Theravada tradition. And there is a different version in that there are two sets of Buddhist sutras. So when we talk about a sutra, it means a teaching that is ascribed to the Buddha. I mean, I think clearly in terms of modern sort of academic scholarship, we'd have to say it's very unlikely that some of the Mahayana sutras were actually spoken in those words by the Buddha 2,500 years ago, but they have been accepted as the word of the Buddha. In the Tibetan culture and in other Buddhist countries as well, sometimes the phrase "the word of the Buddha," this is the word of the Buddha. It simply means it's true. It's absolutely true. So I think we don't need to think that the Tibetan, masters were hopelessly naive in thinking that all of these things were actually said by the Buddha. But they would say, I think, that in a sense they were, because it may be the Buddha speaking through later masters who themselves were enlightened and could speak with that level of authority that those teachings became completely accepted by all the great masters. So that's more in the Mahayana tradition. In the Theravada tradition, we have the Tripitaka, the three baskets of teachings, the Vinaya, the Sutra discourses, and the Abhidharma. And those were written down at the third Buddhist council in about 400 years after the Buddha's death. And within the Theravada tradition, they feel those were all actually spoken by the Buddha. And those are the sutras. It is, of course, quite doubtful that they all were literally spoken by the Buddha. But this one, I think there's absolutely no doubt. I mean, it may not be the exact same words, but I think, it has the ring of authenticity about it to me. It pervades all the other sutras, speak about this in the same terms. And so I think we can really, as I say, it may not be literally word for word, because of course it was handed down for generations in an oral tradition. But I think we can say, this is as near as anything, this is what the Buddha actually said. It was the very first teaching he gave. And if we think about it, in that first teaching, he was going to try to distill the very essence of what he had seen in his enlightenment experience. So that's just to stress the importance of this teaching on the Four Noble Truths. That we really, as Buddhists, if we want to kind of follow the Buddhist spiritual path, if we want to understand it, by the way, coming here and signing up for this course doesn't mean you have to think that you're a Buddhist, you have to be a Buddhist. It's fine to come here and just because you want to find out stuff, just want to out of interest. But I suspect that most of you have a more deeper motivation than that. But if you want to really understand what Buddhism is about, you need to understand this on a deep level. And if you want to practice Buddhism, in a way, this is the substance of your practice. Everything that you do, whatever other practices you do, whether it be Sutra, Mahayana, or Tantra, whatever, is within the framework of this sort of very concise explanation of what this Buddhist spiritual path is. Okay. So yes, it was given by the Buddha allegedly 7 weeks after he attained enlightenment. So he had been practicing together with this group of 5. They're called monks, which is interesting, isn't it? Because they obviously hadn't been ordained by the Buddha. Called bhikshus. They would probably at the time have been called sannyasin or something like that. You know, that they were people who had renounced the everyday worldly life and gone to devote themselves completely 100% to spiritual practice, to the search for liberation, called moksha, freedom from suffering. And at that time, there were different ways that people kind of set out to try to attain liberation. The Buddha had studied meditation with 4 of the greatest meditation teachers of the time, and he found that none of them were able to, through following their teachings, he wasn't able to attain the solution to his problem. And the problem that the Buddha was seeking to solve was the problem of human suffering, the problem of suffering, better say, not just human suffering. But, as a very privileged, wealthy, he was a son of a ruler, he had everything he needed, he had, apparently numerous wives and a palace and all this stuff. It's often, I think, probably exaggerated, but nevertheless, he was a privileged person who was not subject to the most sort of gravest, most obvious sufferings that other people were. But at some point, he became so troubled by seeing how suffering is universal. Everybody suffers and there seems to be no way out of it. The belief in rebirth was prevalent at the time. So how can we find a way to be free from suffering? Because that is the fundamental desire of every living being. It's like at the base of our motivation for doing anything is that we want freedom to be free from suffering, and we want to attain happiness. So, as I say, he studied with these 4 great meditation teachers, but however, whatever kind of states of peace and insight that he was able to attain with them, he still felt that the full solution to the problem of suffering had eluded him, and they said, well, we've taught you everything we know. So at that point, he embarked on this path of asceticism, which is still practiced widely in India today. You'll see these kind of, sadhus or fakirs or whatever they call them, who practice very severe fasting or not sleeping for weeks on end, or not speaking, going naked, or sitting with one arm in the air for years and years until it withers. These very extreme, some of these very extreme practices. And the Buddha said that no one had practiced this more, in a more extreme way than he had. I read recently a description that he gave of the things that he actually did, and it's quite, So that it shows the strength of his motivation. He was absolutely determined to find a solution to the problem of suffering, and at the time, that is the way that people thought it could be because I guess it was something like that, through voluntarily imposing extreme suffering on yourself, you kind of use up all of the negative karma. The idea of karma, I think, existed to a certain extent before the Buddha, but I think it was actually fully articulated and developed by the Buddha himself. That's one conclusion of some things that I've recently read. It's so maybe it wasn't clear, but that's how people believed they could attain liberation. The Buddha practiced that for 6 years, and you will sometimes see paintings or statues of the Buddha as almost like a living skeleton, completely wasted away. You can see all the bones and poking through, and the face looks like a skull. there's a statue like that at the Root Institute in Bodh Gaya, and there's an inscription by Lama Zopa underneath saying, you know, this is to remind you that nobody ever attained enlightenment without undergoing hardship. And the Buddha said nobody did that more thoroughly than himself. But eventually, you know, he came to the conclusion, this is not working. You know, I'm nowhere nearer really to an answer to my problem than at the beginning. So he abandoned that practice, and probably fortunately for us, he had decided, he left the group of 5 monks, and he was sat under a tree to meditate. And fortunately for us, it happened that a milkmaid passed by, who had she was going into the forest to make an offering to the forest god, the god of the forest, which was a special, like rice pudding actually, you know, milk rice, and it was made apparently from, you know, the rice with cream from the milk of a cow that had been fed with 7 cows had been fed with milk, and then they fed to, I think it was maybe 49 cows, and their milk, very rich milk, was fed to another 7 cows, and that extremely rich milk was fed to 1 cow, and then that milk was used to make the rice pudding. So it's a very rich, food, and the Buddha revived physically and was then able, because he was so wasted and weak that he couldn't meditate properly. So he ate that special rice offering. The milkmaid obviously thought it was the forest god because there was radiance coming from his body. And that's when he entered into meditation and on what's called the Vajra seat. So it's still there in Bodh Gaya. You know, you can see it underneath the Bodhi tree, which is a tree. The one that's there now is actually apparent. I think it's the great grandson or daughter of the original tree. And he sat there and he resolved not to get up from his meditation until he'd cracked the problem, until he'd attained enlightenment, until he had found the true answer to the problem of suffering. I think he went into meditation at sunset and he attained enlightenment at sunrise, and there's a story about what happened there. And he then remained in that place for 7 weeks, meditating, doing various things apparently, and then he returned to Varanasi, where these 5 ascetics, he'd gone from Varanasi to Bodh Gaya, and he came back and found them. And when they saw him coming, they said, "No, we won't look at him, we won't recognize him because he's abandoned the practice." But as he came nearer, they saw the radiance coming from his body, and they realized, oh, perhaps we should listen. And that's when he gave this discourse. And so that's partly why he begins with, explaining the middle path. So he'd experienced both extremes of a sort of life of sensual pleasure and material wealth and so on, and then the opposite extreme of self-mortification. He said, yeah, neither of these work, it's in between the two that we need to be. So the sutra breaks down into 3 parts. The first part is where he talks about the middle path, and it's I guess it's quite significant. That's the very first thing that the Buddha said. So, in a lot of ways, you can see the essence of Buddhism as being avoiding extremes. We'll see that when we come to talk about the philosophical view within Buddhism. That also is a middle way in a different sense. But for us, this is good advice that we need to practice this moderation. We won't get very far in our spiritual practice unless we give up or reduce the extent to which we involve ourselves in indulgence in sense pleasures. If we do that, if we drink a lot or smoke a lot, or we spend a lot of time sort of hanging out with people, just chatting about everything generally, or etc. We might hope to suddenly have an awakening experience, but it's not very likely to happen. And again, although we're not likely to try and do what the Buddha did, and fast for weeks on end and deprive ourselves of sleep, etc., we do need to take care of ourselves and not push ourselves to. I think that's it's a big danger for some people, and I can speak from personal experience. There have been times when, oh yes, I'm going to, really go for it now, and try and overdo it, and then you end up disappointed and stressed, and it doesn't really work. So we need to find the balance between those two that actually works. My first teacher, John Marshall, always said, a spiritual practice should be like a good pair of shoes. You're neither too tight nor too loose. So sometimes when we read, this life stories of the great Tibetan masters and so on, we feel, oh, I'm not, I'm just not trying hard enough. I need to push myself more. And okay, up to a point, it's good to, get a little bit out of our comfort zone, but there is this danger of overdoing it, and it's really not helpful, So be kind to yourself. So that's very important. But that's just a short, the introductory first part of the sutra talks about that. And then we come on to the Four Noble Truths, and this is the heart of the teaching. So even though it's very, very short, actually, it's only about, it's just 5 paragraphs, isn't it? Yeah. So if we know this short passage of about 150 words or something like that, in a way, that is the Buddha's teaching. So really take this to heart. So it's when I proposed to Geshe Tashi, doing a sort of mini version of the Foundation of Buddhist Thought over a course of 1 year, and he was coming one summer teaching for a full weekend, and I said, well, let's, my proposal was we do the Four Noble Truths in the first term, and then we do I think it's a mind training, which is very, very fundamental Mahayana Buddhist teaching. Then we do a term on emptiness. And that's what he did. But his initial response was to do the whole year on the Four Noble Truths. That's how important Geshe Tashi feels it is. Maybe I should have gone with that. I don't know. So it's great that we get this opportunity to spend 3 months looking at it. So this is the teaching. There is suffering in life. All living beings experience suffering from the moment of birth until the moment of death, in one form or another. And no one wants to. We all want to be free from suffering. And so we try by all kinds of different methods to free ourselves, don't we? Whenever we experience some kind of suffering, whatever it is, we try to do something to remove that suffering. So the First Noble Truth is really obvious. It's like we all know that. We all know that there is suffering. What is special, I suppose, about it is that pointing out that recognition of that truth is the beginning of the spiritual path. That's the first thing we're confronted with, or we should be confronted with when we embark on the spiritual path, is suffering. Why did the Buddha say that first? Because it reveals the reason for practicing the spiritual path. So in the Bible it says, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. Okay? but first of all, that raises a host of questions, and doubts, and we might wonder, oh, is that true? We can get lost in that. Secondly, kind of, well, what has that got to do with me? You might ask. So I'm not criticizing the Bible, not in the least, but what I'm pointing out is that when the Buddha states this truth of suffering, at the very first thing almost that he says, there is suffering. This is the problem. This is what our journey is about. We don't really embark on the spiritual path, in a sense, because we want to understand who God is. We might, but this fact of suffering is so fundamental and unarguable. I mean, I think no one doubts that truth. No one doubts that there is such a thing as suffering in our life. That I, in fact, am experiencing suffering, and I need to do something about it. So, as I say, right at the very beginning, we have that clarity about what is the purpose of this journey. Why are we doing this? The second noble truth, this is really, I think, you can say that this second noble truth is Buddhism. Where, everyone accepts that there's suffering, but in general, most people operate from a misunderstanding about where suffering comes from, and that's the problem. Because if we think suffering comes from essentially from outside of us, we will dedicate all of our efforts to changing that external situation, right? And the problem with that is it never works. We can get rid of one temporary manifestation of suffering. We can't get rid of suffering that way. Even if it was true that suffering comes from things outside us, we don't have control of the whole universe. We'd have to control the whole universe to stop suffering from arising. But in fact, what the Buddha is saying most essentially is suffering does not come primarily or fundamentally from the external situation. It comes from within us. It comes from the mind. And because that's true that it's possible to be free from suffering. Because we do, although we may find it difficult to control our mind, but it's within our domain, isn't it? It is within it's not in anybody else's control. What happens in my mind, I may need to learn to control my mind, but there's not anybody else or anything else which is controlling it for me. I may not know how to drive the car, but I'm in the driving seat. Yeah. If I crash into the wall, it's because I need to learn a bit more about how to drive. So that, to me, that's the essence of Buddhist teaching, that we have a very, very deeply ingrained habit of thinking and believing and acting as if suffering comes from outside. The cause of suffering, the true origin of suffering is something or somebody out there, but in reality it isn't. It's within me. Okay, so the suffering itself isn't the external situation, but it's how I respond to that external situation that is the suffering, isn't it? It's my internal response, my mental and emotional reaction to what's happening that creates the suffering. So the Buddha says it's craving. And this cause origin is explained differently in, slightly different emphasis or different words in different Buddhist teachings. And here he's emphasizing the craving. The word is Sanskrit or Pali word is tanha. Tanha in Pali, tushna in Sanskrit, which means thirst. Tushna, thirst. So if we think about that, you know, what's it like to be really thirsty? I mean, most of us hardly ever experience that. But if you're really, really thirsty, you know, you've been walking across the desert for 2 or 3 hours without a drink. You know what that means? It's like irresistible impulse to want to get some water, isn't it? So that kind of craving, almost, you know, obsessive or compulsive desire for something. The Buddha is saying that all of our suffering in one way or another is created by that kind of compulsive desire that we feel, you know, unless I have this, I can't be all right. So anyway, I'm going to talk a lot more about that in the second weekend. So that's the cause. The cause is within the mind. And therefore, if it's possible to remove that cause from the mind, then there would be no suffering. Perhaps that's also, you know, you have to add that because if that mental factor of craving, grasping, clinging, attachment, whatever we call it, there's slightly different shades of meaning there. If that was inherent in the very nature of the mind, then we could never be free from suffering. So the third noble truth, the cessation of suffering, says it's not true that it's in the nature of the mind, although we have a very strong habit for lifetime after lifetime of relating to things with this craving or grasping. Nevertheless, it's not built into the very fact that we have a mind. It's a temporary, it comes and goes, it's not part of the nature of the mind, and therefore it's possible to completely remove it, to uproot it from the mind, and if that is done, then there will be no more suffering. And then the only remaining question is, how can we do that? And so that's the fourth noble truth, the path, the method that leads to freedom from suffering. And in this original discourse, the Buddha explains it in terms of the eightfold path, but you can condense that into 3, which is moral discipline, concentration or meditation, and wisdom. Those are the kind of 3 stages of the path. In the Four Noble Truths Sutra, actually the wisdom one comes first. He talks about right view, because we have to understand things in order to kind of practice the path. We have to know what it is. We have to understand it. So we have to. So in this context, right view means understanding the Four Noble Truths, actually. So we understand that, and then we need to practice moral discipline, restraining our actions so that we don't create chaos in our lives, and we remove the more obvious forms of suffering, and then using meditation we can get down to the deeper roots of suffering. Concentration, become, you know, increasingly have mental peace, but then finally the wisdom comes back again with the actual way to uproot the root cause of suffering is through deep meditation on the true nature of reality. So we'll come back to that. So as I say, that quite simple teaching in a way is the whole of Buddhism. Of course there's a lot more to be said, you know, details to be filled in. But nevertheless, you know, if we deeply internalize that teaching, then we're on the right track. So in these talks, by the way, I'm trying to follow the outline of Geshe Tashi's book, but I will be straying off here and there and putting it in my own style. But I will set the reading, the section for the book. For this weekend, it will be the first 2 chapters of the book. And please do read it carefully and reflect on it, because obviously Geshe Tashi's wisdom, his perspective on it, will add a great deal to it. So traditionally in Tibetan Buddhist teaching, you should always start with explaining the benefits of whatever topic it is that you're of studying, whatever, or meditating on whatever topic you're teaching about. Hearing, contemplation and meditation is the phrase. So as I'm speaking, hopefully you're listening and you gain some benefit from that. Then you go away and think about the topic, reflect on it, come to your own conclusions. Is it true? Is it not true? How does it affect me? How does it apply to me? Etc., etc. Second level, and then the third level, meditation, with that understanding, really to kind of soak your mind in that topic, in that teaching, so that it begins to transform our mind. So what are the benefits of hearing, contemplating and meditating on Four Noble Truths? And Geshe Tashi talks about 3 levels of benefit. So first of all, just by knowing, that it's true, just by understanding on an intellectual level, it helps a little bit. It gives us some inspiration, some sense of, it's possible to be free from suffering. It will have a tendency to point our life in a slightly different direction. And if you look out there, it looks like there are a lot of people who don't look at life in this way, that the problem is in here. A lot of people, probably most people, think the problem is out there. I haven't got enough money, I haven't got the right partner, I haven't got the right job, I haven't got the right car, I have this very, very annoying colleague at work, and if only he would drop dead, everything would be fine, etc., etc. Now, we all have these thoughts, but as soon as we understand and we recognize the validity of the Buddha's teaching here, then we will start to relate differently to those situations, and we will stop creating quite so much havoc in our own lives. It takes a long time to overcome the habits, but even just to have that perspective on life is very beneficial. But if it goes a little deeper, then we begin to develop a real sort of sense of determination about it. That suffering is a real problem. I need to do something about it. I need to change my life in certain ways so that I am really moving in the direction of this freedom from suffering. So, thinking more deeply about it, we will start to get that sense of real resolve. I'm going to put these teachings into practice. And then, of course, we find it's not quite as easy as we thought. After a little while, it may seem we may have a really, I think often there's this, with the spiritual practice, there's this kind of honeymoon period where it's for a while, it's really wonderful and amazing, And then we tend to come up, at some point, we come up against difficulties. It becomes a struggle. We think, I'm worse off than I was before. Is it? I was teaching in Hull this week, and I saw that with somebody who was really she was literally in tears, over the suffering that she was experiencing from being on the spiritual path. She recognized that was what she needed to be, but, we have to confront the sort of facts about ourself. That sometimes can be difficult as we start to look deeper into ourselves and start to confront it. So it isn't a joyride all the time, but if we do kind of, and here what I'm really talking about is taking refuge. Yeah, so we can be interested in Buddhism. We can benefit from reading about Buddhism, and a lot of people do. I mean, it's very widespread these days. People, yeah, I really respect the Buddhist teachings. I think Buddhism is great, and I often read Buddhist books. But making that decision that, I am going to put these teachings into practice in my own life, and even as it becomes sometimes a little bit tough, sticking with that decision, that's a much bigger level of benefit, actually, even though sometimes you might feel, but still, the reality is it creates very, very positive change in our lives. And then the third benefit is very important that Geshe Tashi points out, because so far I've been talking about how it affects me, how it affects oneself. But the kind of deep understanding of the Four Noble Truths is the fundamental basis for compassion, isn't it? That we may have some compassion because we see somebody suffering in an obvious way and we want to help them, which is fine, that's great. But when we talk about compassion, especially great compassion in the context of the Mahayana spiritual path, it's through recognizing how all living beings are trapped in this cycle of suffering, death and rebirth, all of the things that the Buddha talks about: birth, aging, sickness and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief and despair, and so on. And how that arises from the mental factors, delusions of craving and grasping and so on. The fact that it is possible to be free, because if it were not possible to be free from those sufferings, in a way, like, our compassion would not be, like, compassion should be something active. It's an intention, a wish to free somebody from their suffering. If it were impossible to do that, then it wouldn't quite be compassion in the full sense. And then, of course, for that compassion to be effective and to really make a difference to the lives of others, we need to understand the path, that they can only become free by adopting a certain way of life and thought, which is what Buddhism is. So this is the most profound benefit, that through really deeply studying, contemplating and meditating on the Four Noble Truths, we will develop great compassion and ultimately bodhicitta. So it's a mistake to think that the Four Noble Truths is like a Hinayana teaching. It's not. It can be related to on that level. It can also be related to as a Mahayana teaching. So these Four Noble Truths are not just about my suffering, but about suffering in general, universal suffering. Everyone is in the same boat. And they will stay there until those who are fortunate enough to have the opportunity for spiritual practice put those teachings into practice and become able themselves, gain the ability to lead others to freedom. So I think I'm going to just stop there for the moment, and a little bit of time for questions. Anybody got a question or a thought? You just turn it off. Oh, sorry. Okay. Never mind. Turn it off at the computer, Cesare. Click the button to stop it. Yeah.
Can I